time we speak of the Pluto in Scorpio generation. It's just me, don't be scared, but be a little scared. Because Pluto in Scorpio is a little bit like the whole Chancellor Palpatine thing. People were decorating their houses to look like the Death Star during the 1980s. And Chancellor Palpatine's office, that pretty much could have been any executive office during the Pluto in Scorpio years. Everything was sleek and dark and black and dangerous. Now, the latter years of Pluto in Libra had indeed yielded a return to the conservative, as Saturn and Jupiter had their conjunction in that sign, and Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were at their height in the early 1980s. And the latter part of the 1980s was a rather difficult time as Pluto was in Scorpio for several reasons. People were doing very well economically at the top end of the spectrum, and it was really the time when banks and bankers began solidifying their power and control over everything. And the very fact that the savings and loan scandal or the Iran-Contra controversy or incident didn't really cause much in the way of controversy is an indication of exactly how much towards the power and powerful everything was tilting at that time. For everybody else, things weren't all that wonderful, though. The crime rate was soaring, and you had to do things like put a club on your car. It was a thing that went across the steering wheel so that you couldn't drive away with it. And we took our stereos with us, the car stereo in what was called a Benzie box. You had to bring your car stereo with you, pull it out of the car so that nobody would break into your car and steal your stereo. Believe it or not, during the 1980s, during the Pluto and Scorpio years, all the way through the part of the 90s, when you heard a car alarm go off, you actually thought somebody might be stealing a car, as opposed to, some idiot down the block just didn't shut his alarm off or something like that. It was a very, very difficult time in terms of crime. There was the height of the cocaine era, and for the sort of the wealthy bankers, there was the white powder cocaine, sort of bonfire of the vanities type of thing. But on the other hand, crack vials were all across the streets of cities. And it was also at that time that you saw people were guarding up their houses, and wrought iron doors went on top of the outside front doors and back doors of houses, and the first floor windows were also covered with bars, and sometimes the second floor windows were covered with bars because crime was getting really out of hand, and there was a sort of sense of fear during the Pluto and Scorpio years, and that fear was not entirely misplaced. But nothing typified the Pluto and Scorpio years so much as the AIDS virus. It's hard to imagine now that we're at the Saturn return of the introduction to our mass consciousness of the AIDS virus, exactly what an effect that had. After the 60s and the 70s, all of a sudden, the sexual revolution just stopped dead in its tracks, essentially, as we started to recognize that at the time, it was pretty much the thought, well, if you had sex with anybody in the last 5 years that had sex with anybody within the last 5 years and so on, then you may have a deadly, incurable disease. It was pretty horrifying, and it was something that really entered into our consciousness all of a sudden as Pluto came into Scorpio, and it stayed there throughout the Pluto and Scorpio years. And of course, it wasn't just sex that would have the possible effect. It was also blood transfusions and things like that, surgery, other scorpionic things that became extraordinarily deadly. It didn't help at the time that hypodermic needles were washing up onto the shores, and although there probably wasn't any direct danger of getting AIDS through stepping on a hypodermic needle, it was something that medical waste was showing up at that time. There wasn't really much of a chance of it, but it was a very fearful time. It was a very paranoid time. And so what of the Pluto and Scorpio generation? Well, one thing, they were born at a time when death was on everyone's mind, and they really seemed to embrace it in their collective unconscious, if not their collective consciousness. We see that in their style. They've taken the goth and emo styles to a kind of comfort level. It's almost like a rejection of the usual sense of aesthetics and the sort of favoring of this sort of dark type of approach that is very much part of the Pluto and Scorpio way. Tattoos, of course, are a way of showing, on the one hand, the deep commitment to something, which is part of Pluto and Scorpio, and yet on the other hand, a kind of ambivalence about the body. The sort of, we can put something into the body or put something on the body and keep it there forever because we don't really know how long forever is. There's an air of resignation about the Pluto and Scorpio generation that might almost be troubling at times. When Johnny Rotten sang in the 70s about having no future, he was angry. And when Kurt Cobain sang about it later during the Pluto and Scorpio years, he was resigned. And I think some of that resignation comes into the Pluto and Scorpio generation. And yet they can be very, very passionate about things. As a matter of fact, when we consider the upcoming Pluto-Uranus square, the Pluto in Scorpio generation is really Pluto's foot soldiers in this event that'll be playing out over the next few years. The Occupy demonstrators, for example, are pretty much of the Pluto and Scorpio generation, and they're very passionate and they're very committed, and they are very willing to go to the really going as far as they need to go. But on the other hand, most of the military, most of the people in the military at this time are Pluto and Scorpio people, and a good part of the police force is also Pluto and Scorpio. So they'll be fighting on both sides very passionate, both sides very much intent on expressing power in different ways perhaps, but very much intent on expressing power nonetheless. And that's something that really indicates that this generation is out there to help affect transformation, even if it is not necessarily in the way that they anticipate. While the sexual revolution may have been brought to something of a halt during the Pluto and Scorpio years, the Pluto and Scorpio generation is in their own way carrying forward the energy of that revolution. Now, the Pluto and Libra generation, the generation that was born just before them during the 1970s mostly, that generation tends to believe that people should be able to have whatever type of relationship they want. And with the emphasis on relationship, issues like gay marriage become something that they are able to embrace very directly. The Pluto and Scorpio generation is a little bit more direct in this, and it's not relationship, it's sex. You should be able to have whatever type of sex you want. Of course, as with any generation, people will polarize very much on either side of an issue, so that some people will feel that it's something worth fighting for to be open about things, and others will feel that it is something that is to be fought against. At the end of the day, a kind of casualness about the issue is the ultimate result. And you'll see the Pluto and Scorpio generation, when they're not out trying to change the structure of the political and economic world, is actually helping to change the sexual landscape, if nothing else, by simply normalizing just about everything, despite themselves much of the time. As the Pluto and Scorpio generation begins to hit their Saturn returns over the next few years, you'll start to see them come into power, at least in moderately powerful positions, and you'll see that they are among the most willing to make changes and among the most unwilling to allow changes. There'll be a real consolidation of power coming from the Pluto and Scorpio generation, although they're going to try to consolidate power in essentially opposing ways, or essentially in many, many different ways, so that the Pluto and Scorpio generation cannot be said to have any one particular political viewpoint or economic viewpoint or anything like that, but what you can expect to see from them is a great deal of passion.